Fun fact, the current global trade system was decided upon in a bougie New Hampshire resort called Bretton Woods towards the end of World War II. This is the meeting that laid the foundation for the U.S. as the controller of the World Monetary Order. This was also where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created. What event kickstarted this global financial system, and how did the U.S. end up on top? Today, I'm going to be giving you a history lesson that you definitely don't want to repeat. Let's get it. BitSwap is the hottest new way to trade tokens. Crawling all the top decentralized exchanges, BitSwap gets you the very best price and value for your trades. BitSwap is changing the game. Try it now at bitswapdex.io. Welcome to BitBoy Crypto. My name is Ben. Every day I show you how to make money in cryptocurrency. If you like money, then please make sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to see even more crypto content, you can follow our BitSquad channels. In today's video, we're going to talk about the history of the Bretton Woods Agreement and how it came to be, ushering in the current international monetary system. Now, I bet some of you guys are familiar with the IMF and the World Bank, but do you know the history of how these institutions came into being? Well, I'm going to break it all down for you right now. Cue the jazz music. These institutions of the World Monetary Order, known as the Bretton Woods System, were created as a result of a 1944 conference between all of the World War II allied nations. This conference, called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, took place at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, which is where the Bretton Woods system got its name from. This conference was led by famous economist John Maynard Keynes of the British Treasury and Harry Dexter White of the U.S. Treasury, both of whom had already begun independently developing ideas about what the financial order of the post-World War II world would look like. Interesting to note is that this was the very first time in history that a unified monetary order for basically the whole world was explicitly negotiated and structured with a set of written rules. So what were the rules of this world monetary order? Well, one of the rules was a movement away from the strict adherence to the gold standard. For those of you who don't know, the gold standard was a system where each country would back its currency with gold by guaranteeing that the country would redeem its currency for its equivalent value in gold. Interested in seeing why Bitcoin is better than gold? Well, check out this video that I did here. Now, up until World War I, most of the developed countries were on the gold standard. However, as a result of World War II, most countries cut their ties to gold so they could print the amount of currency they needed to pay for their war costs. This massive expansion of the monetary supply was far greater than the demand, which led to serious hyperinflation. The hyperinflation was so bad in some countries that in certain extreme cases, people would need a whole wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread from the market. As a result, after the end of the war, almost all of these countries returned to the safety of the gold standard. Things seemed to return relatively back to normal, that is, until the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. As a result of the stock market crash, investors lost their faith in stocks and instead switched to commodity trading. This drove up the price of gold, which resulted in massive numbers of people redeeming their dollars for the safer store of value, which was gold. This led to people stockpiling gold, and to stop this trend in 1933, FDR created an executive order making it illegal for citizens to own gold in any form. Sounds familiar? This created the perfect situation needed to set up the stage for Bretton Woods. Like I said, one of the biggest changes that the Bretton Woods system introduced was a movement away from the gold standard. At Bretton Woods, each member country agreed to redeem its currency for US dollars, not gold. Also part of this agreement was that the US dollar was to be tied to gold at a fixed price. At the time, $35 per ounce. This established the US dollar as the global reserve currency, as the US dollar had now become a substitute for gold. As a result of this, the US dollar began to increase in value relative to the value of other currencies. This created greater demand for dollars, even though the dollar's worth in gold remained the same. This disparity in value would plant the seed that would lead to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system 3 decades later. However, I'll get into that in the next video in this series. So why US dollars, you ask? Well, for 2 reasons. The first reason is that as a result of FDR's executive order making it illegal for citizens to own gold, the United States held 75% of the world's gold supply. No other nation's currency had enough gold to back it as a replacement. The second reason is that because this conference was being held in the US, it would make sense that the US would obviously use this meeting to position itself as the world's dominant economic power. In order to enforce this, the Bretton Woods Agreement also created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Both organizations are backed by the US and in charge of monitoring this new system. So despite its name, the World Bank is not the world's central bank. Originally, the World Bank was established to loan money to the European countries that had been devastated by World War II for something known as the Lend-Lease Act. However, over time, the function of the World Bank shifted to loaning out money to projects that would boost the economy in developing countries. The real key to the success of the Bretton Woods system, however, was the establishment of the IMF. The Bretton Woods system relied on the IMF to enforce its rules and regulations, which allowed the system to function. One of these rules that the IMF enforced was the agreement regarding fixed exchange rates. Member countries pledged that their central banks would maintain fixed exchange rates between their own currencies and the US dollar. So if the value of a country's currency became too weak compared to the US dollar, its central bank would buy up its own currency in foreign exchange markets, kind of like a buyback. Purchasing their currency would reduce the total supply and thus increase its value. If a currency's value became too high, the central bank would just print more. Printing more currency would expand the supply and thus lower the currency's value. These fixed exchange rates, later known as adjustable pegs, allow countries to get back to equilibrium if the country's currency got too far out of whack. For instance, if the country had too great of a trade deficit. This also meant the member countries had an agreement to avoid trade wars. The countries promised that they would not lower the value of their currencies in order to increase trade. However, they were allowed to regulate their own currencies under certain conditions. For example, they could adjust their currency values to rebuild their economy in the aftermath of a war, or they could take action if some kind of foreign investment started to destabilize their economy. The Bretton Woods system created a set of rules for a global financial system that gave economic security to the member countries around the world and put America in the top spot as the global economic superpower. But the Bretton Woods system is no longer around. So what the heck happened? In our next video in this series, we are going to go over just that. We're going to see the downfall of the Bretton Woods system and tell you exactly what went wrong and what we need to be careful about in the future. So that's it for this video. What do you guys think? Was the Bretton Woods Agreement good because it made us the controller of the world economy? Or did the establishment of the IMF create a dangerous and unsustainable situation to allow the New World Order to rise in its place? Drop me your comments down below. That's all I got. Be blessed. BitBoy out.